All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the second webinar of our three-part series on K-12 financial education requirements. My name is Raven Newberry, and I'm the Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the National Endowment for Financial Education. So as we have been building up to NEFI's 2024 Financial Education, Innovation, and Impact Summit, we have been spotlighting important topics in the field of financial education. So with the continuing momentum we've been seeing around state K-12 financial education requirements, it's the perfect time to explore this topic by featuring experts and advocates from across the country. So in part one, our webinar yesterday, we focused on passing legislation, and today we are focusing on a very important aspect of state requirements, which is funding their implementation. So our two speakers today are going to share about a funding mechanism proposal in Ohio that was developed as a public-private partnership, and share their experiences with that funding mechanism as a case study for other states who might be looking to implement something similar. Just a little bit about the panel structure. We're going to have 20 minutes of prepared questions with our two speakers today, Brian and Evan, and then we have 10 minutes for audience Q&A. So throughout the webinar, feel free to enter in any questions or comments into the Q&A box, and we'll have those queued up for our two experts to answer at the end of the webinar. And we will be sending out the recording of this webinar following. It's later this week to everyone who registered, as well as slides. So with that said, I would like to turn it over to Brian and Evan to introduce themselves, their role with the requirement in Ohio, and their role with the proposed funding mechanism. So let's start with Brian.
Hey, first, thanks for having us. I know I'm excited. Evan and I have talked offline. We're excited to share what we learned in Ohio. I'm Brian Page. I was a public school teacher in Ohio for 15 years, and I was a part of a group that advocated for personal finance to be a semester-long requirement for graduation. After that, I was at Next in Personal Finance, had a senior role there, and then just finished serving a one-year term at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as a visiting scholar in their Office of Youth Financial Education.
All right, I'm Evan Kleymeyer. I am the Senior Vice President of Government and External Relations at the Ohio Bankers League. We are the trade association that represents all the banks in the state of Ohio. Brian was really the impetus to getting the Ohio Bankers League involved. We had heard from all of our member banks that their customers did not have basic financial literacy, and that made them difficult bank customers. And so from our vantage point, making sure that these the future customers of our banks get the requisite financial literacy training in school was something that our membership felt very strongly we needed to be involved in. And so we were able to work with Brian and with a broader coalition to craft legislation in Ohio, to craft the funding mechanism in that legislation and get that passed through the legislature.
Wonderful. Well, let's thank you for the introductions, and we can go ahead and jump into our planned panel questions. So our first question is, can you share more what the process was like in securing and developing that funding mechanism for Ohio's K-12 financial education mandate? And Evan, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah. So when we were crafting the legislation, we basically focused on three things. The first one is it had to be a standalone graduation requirement. The second one was that the teachers needed to demonstrate competency in the subject they were going to be teaching. And the third one was it had to be funded. I was a legislative aide at the State House before coming to the Ohio Bankers League. My boss sat on the education committee, and we always heard, and you all know this, we always heard it is an unfunded mandate from the legislature down to the schools. We knew if it was unfunded, the financial literacy bill was doomed. And so we had to come up with a mechanism to do it. And so what we ended up finding was a way to front load the investment into the teacher training mechanism and then allow for a public-private partnership to replenish that fund. And so we met with the Ohio Department of Education, and they gave us, it was about 3,000 teachers in the state of Ohio who would need some sort of training to demonstrate competency. And we came up with basically a sort of $500 on average per teacher. And that spit out what we were looking to do, which was get about $1.5 million. And when we're talking about state like Ohio, $80 billion 2-year budget every year. $1.5 million is not much for us to raise. So we met with members of the legislature. We were not going to, it became very clear, we were not going to get a direct appropriations for this. And so we had to find a way to come up with this money. And what we did was we borrowed from the unclaimed funds department in Ohio. We borrowed $1.5 million to establish a fund that the treasurer of state would manage. And then when we wrote the legislation, we wrote that private entities, public entities, individuals could donate money back to that fund in order to repay the state. And I think it was we had a 3-year period where the state treasurer would have to pay back the $1.5 million to unclaimed funds. And so it was important for us to basically front load the money and then allow for participation, because we had banks here in the state of Ohio. Once we went and we started to tell them what this money is going to do, it's going to train all these teachers to then be able to teach your future customers financial literacy. We had banks who were willing to donate, willing to give to that fund, and that allowed us to do that sort of public-private partnership in order to get those necessary funds. Brian, you were also, very involved in that. Anything you want to add on the funding mechanism?
I think just coming back to just more big picture, high level, that really broke through the barrier of having a meaningful conversation to pass the legislation. I don't recall ever having to have a detailed conversation about how that's structured and how that would work beyond how it perhaps would impact a teacher or an administrator. They just needed to know it was there.
It sounds like that conversation around funding happened very early on. Is that right? Was that right at the beginning of talks around legislation in this advocacy movement?
Yeah, I think it's because we've all seen the normal pitfalls of the legislature pushing down a requirement on schools, and then schools, pushing back and saying, we're already stretched thin with funding, and now you're adding one more layer onto us. And I have been around a decent amount of education public policy discussions here in Ohio, and it feels like as soon as you hear that unfunded mandate, that change, that legislation just gets stuck in the mud and then never really goes anywhere. So we wanted to address that early on.
That's great. Evan, they were lucky to have you with your legislative background and being in the private sector. So it's a great connection. And this is a great segue into our next question, which is for Brian. As an advocate, could you talk more about your strategies for making the case for financial education? And where were those points of pushback and how did you address them?
Well, making the case is not challenging. I don't think I ever had anyone say to me that they don't think that kids should learn how to manage money. So, obviously, case studies are helpful, data points are helpful, but really, you have to break through and understand what is it that's in the way of passing legislation. And, those types of conversations are going to be unique to your state. And what we found was that not only have schools experienced in some districts, some pitfalls as a result of past legislation, unintended consequences, let's say, but also they're strapped for funding. But they had bill after bill, like Race to the Top as an example, that had been passed in recent years, and so they initially we're like, look, enough. We don't want any more change. So You had to, I think the first step is just understanding how to work through what those specific barriers looked like. And then identify, the pain points or the anxiety points. So in Ohio, those were for teachers, job security, and for administrators, it would be anything that would add, additional efforts to try to run a school. And from our perspective, and the Senator Wilson and Evan and I, obviously our passion was ensuring that the kids themselves were getting the best possible financial education experience that they could, and that sometimes creates competing priorities with the folks who you are negotiating with. And so you had to understand how is it that you can work together to find solutions that are digestible for the folks who have concerns, but also protect what's in the best interest of kids.
Yeah, and to your point on financial education, you typically don't have to make most people understand that it's important. NEFI did some polling and found that 80% of Americans supported financial education in schools. And from a national vantage point, we're seeing this being an incredibly popular bipartisan issue, which is rare. And so I think it is those specific quirks in the state, which was a theme we heard yesterday from our webinar. Could you share how to navigate that, how to figure out what are those specific things, how to figure out what in your state is the thing that you need to navigate? I think that might be helpful for attendees.
Well, I think let's kind of break apart the opposition publicly and then the opposition privately. They're two very different things. It's pretty difficult for any group to stand up and provide testimony as to how financial education would be bad for kids. So typically you'll see testimony where they're interested parties, right? They don't want to go on the record saying that they're against this. I can speak for myself. The school management union was fiercely working behind the scenes to oppose this. Despite the fact that we worked very hard at trying to be as accommodating as possible, they were relentless in trying just to prevent this. They wanted it to be an embedment, because we all know that once you just embed it, it's just really not effective in the high school age groups. But when you embed it, it just really means that on the school management side, there's nothing really they have to do. And so the challenge was, how can you take away any type of argument that they would pose publicly that would sound reasonable and rational, just whether or not it's true. And so early on, one of the things that we recognized was that because schools are strapped for funding, that if you were to simply add this requirement on top of the existing graduation requirements, you can make a rational argument for the need to hire new staff. Training is one thing. Hiring additional staff is not a one-off. It's expensive, and it can be for decades that you're paying for that additional teacher or additional teachers. And as a matter of fact, the school management union tried to claim that one local district wrote them and said they would need to hire 21 new teachers to teach personal finance. And so as a result, we recognized that in Ohio, there were 5 elective credits required to graduate, which in layman's terms means 1 credit is a 1-year class. Most elective classes are semester long. So what you're really looking at is 10 elective semester long classes. So on top of that, most students graduate not only with those 10 semester long classes, but most of them graduate also passing at least another 10. So you're looking at really around 20 classes that are up for grabs, so to speak. And our position was, hey, of those 20 semester classes, we believe that personal finance is important enough to be counted toward that 1/2 credit that's applied towards an elective for graduation. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Evan, because I've been in various states after I left Ohio, but I believe Ohio's graduation limit was, I think it was 20 credits to graduate. And so after the passing of this bill, it stayed at 20. So rather than 5 elective credits to graduate, it became 4.5, and then a half unit of personal finance. So that took away that argument. There was no, so then now the argument is, well, yeah, my kids aren't going to get as many art classes. And that's when, you know, the argument breaks down, when you explain to them, well, they still have 19 other classes that they can take that include art. And they have to also, in the state of Ohio, take, I believe it is, 1.5 years of art. And so there was really no argument that they had remaining that was in any way possible going to be something digestible for the everyday person. They're going to hear and think, okay, you're just kind of against this no matter what. And so once we work through that, then the challenge is who is it that can teach the class, and what is going to be appropriate to ensure they teach the class.
Yeah, and I'll just expand a little bit. We made it very important that we built a broad coalition of supporters of the legislation. And so we brought together folks who are not typically involved in education policy. This is the one and only piece of legislation of education policy that I will work on here at the Ohio Bankers League. You know, normally we're involved in banking issues. We brought in the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, who does, you know, normally employment issues. And by bringing those individuals together, we had enough meetings with different interest groups, trade associations down at the State House where we knew where the pitfalls were going to be or the arguments we were going to hear. And we had all of those meetings well before introduction of legislation. We wanted to grease the skids to make sure this had a viable shot of passing well before we actually ever introduced it. And by bringing different trade associations who regularly work down at the State House on different issues, they also brought their political muscle. They also brought their influence, who are not typically involved in education public policy. And I think that was incredibly helpful to get it across the finish line.
And I need to add on to that. I just, frankly, it wouldn't have passed without it. Because the teachers union was in a precarious position where, you know, it's, even within a union itself, you're going to have varying perspectives. And so although the teachers union was extremely helpful in the process behind the scenes, they weren't the ones using their political muscle to get this passed. They ensured that they did not get in the way. They provided guidance and support as appropriate. And really it was the business community who was pushing this behind the scenes, and conversations they were regularly having in the state capitol building anyway. They just happened to be, you know, on a Wednesday. Now they're going to talk about financial education. And I know that we have, you know, kind of a broad range of stakeholders here. So one thing I would encourage you to do is to form the coalition in advance of writing the bill or working to pass the bill. Evan and I together led Ohio Jumpstart, and that board was comprised of the same folks, and many of the same folks who actively worked to pass this. And so those existing relationships came in handy. And I have to say, it's makes it more difficult for the opposition when they're calling the Ohio Chamber of Commerce and telling them why do you agree that you know, a kid should have 1/2 credit less of art, of all the different art classes that they've had in their life, for personal finance. When you call the chamber with a question like that, there's usually going to be a little bit of laughter on the other end, because all of us that are here probably realize the common sense answer is, make this happen for kids. It's a 21st century survival skill.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thank you both.
and
Oh,
one last thing. I would say, and again, I can only speak for the experiences in Ohio and what we've done. There is not a party that was better situated on the business side than the Bankers League because of their ability to work with the people they already work with to create this funding mechanism. So it's not just the political muscle, but it's also kind of the know-how and the knowledge base that already exists that allow for something like this to come about.
Thank you both for breaking down what happened in Ohio. And I know every state has its unique ecosystem, but I know a lot of that would be transferable to people looking to push for this in their own state. So Evan, you've talked about this a little bit, but a big piece of Ohio is the role of the private sector, specifically financial services. They're supporting this legislation, but what benefits do you see investing in financial education, and what were those benefits seen by other financial services, and why did the Bankers League of Ohio want to be so involved? Could you share more about that?
Yeah, no, it became very clear when I met with our member institutions, large, globally in active institutions, small community banks in rural Ohio, that they see it, real issues surrounding a lack of financial literacy in their customers. Think customers are making bad financial decisions, and there is only so much legally that you can do in those scenarios as a banker. And so they, my members made it very clear to us that this was something we wanted to make a priority and to work on. Additionally, the senator who was the sponsor of the bill, the person who actually had to push it to the other members of the legislature and put his name on it, was a banker for 40 years. And he was able to very clearly go in to his colleagues' offices and say, here's some examples just from my career of people back in my hometown who could have benefited from financial literacy. They're not learning it, at home. They're not learning it at school. And it is costing them more money to use these shadow banking products that they could have gotten at the local community bank down the street had they understood those types of products and put emphasis on financial well-being. And so our members were clamoring for it, and we view this as a huge win for the kids in the state of Ohio, for future bank customers here. And then you start talking about it with the credit unions in Ohio, the insurance companies in Ohio, the business owners who see it in their employees and their customers, that it became very apparent that we needed to bring the business community in to get this across the finish line. And I believe by us being there, we were able to assuage a lot of concerns that would come from members of the legislature.
And I want to address something that would be said to me, but not to Evan, because Evan's representing the banks. So they would, snark, kind of like in a snarky way, say, "Well, I'm sure the banks wouldn't want this, right? The banks love fees." And you have to look at the bigger picture. Just drive through any downtown area and look at the check cashing establishments, and now in other states, the auto title loan establishments, the payday lending establishments. They exist because there are folks who are unable to be banked. And as an educator, it was important that I shared with students that although building your credit score is essential, right? Something that is unfortunately not talked about enough is that there's also scoring done, or at least tracking done, like a credit report, but on the banking side through check systems. And that if you incur fee after fee after fee and you become too expensive, meaning you're losing the bank is losing, or the credit union is losing a lot of money on you, you're going to get kicked out of the banking system, not just that bank that you're with or that credit union, but when you go to open another account, they're going to run that report and they're going to realize that they don't want to bank with you. And so now they're in the shadow banking system, as Evan said, and that is very expensive for consumers. And so from the bank's perspective, and from our perspective, we simply felt like that it's an important marriage, because you're putting them in a system that is designed to be far better and look out for their interest in a greater way than the shadow banking system. So just want to point that out for any folks that are out there that think, well, I don't know what's going on here. Why would the banks or the credit unions be in support of this? That's why.
Yeah, thank you. And Brian, I know you have a powerful story about taking some of your students to a payday lending organization. If we have time, it would be great if you could share it, but I just want to flag that. I know there's an article about it, so maybe we can share that with folks. But I wanted to ask both of you, what future steps or improvements would you like to see with financial education in Ohio?
Go ahead, Brian.
I can go ahead and start. And so in the way that our bill was passed was that through compromise, there were certain teacher licensure areas that were not required to pursue any additional education to teach the class. So you have in those three areas, those licensures are business education, so business career tech education, and family and consumer science. So we'll start with those two. And again, this was a compromise. And those two groups had personal finance questions that were already included on the praxis, which is the teacher license examination that you have to pass in order to be a teacher. So that did make sense that they had demonstrated at one point that they understood financial education. Now, with that said, both associations actually supported and signed a document supporting that they would support an additional requirement for teachers to get additional education. And that was negotiated out for a number of reasons, but it wasn't because of those groups. Social studies teachers had been either teaching personal finance, or they had one or two questions on the praxis. So of the groups in Ohio, about 25% of praxis questions were personal finance on the family consumer science licensure exam, 20% business, one or two social studies after a certain date. So if you're an older teacher, you might have even taken a praxis without having personal finance questions on it. Again, that there was negotiations. That group, we ended up saying, of the three, you can teach it. At least there's some solid footing to stand on there. Back to the superintendent's argument about we'd have to hire teachers. Well, in small rural districts, it is very true that not only are they strapped, but they have a very small staff. It was a very true challenge that they were facing. And so the way that we worked around that was recognizing the need to create flexibility from within existing staff to not only allow existing staff that would likely be the elective teachers to be able to teach this, but it also, for those teachers, provided some job security. And so a validation was created, and that validation is where the money sits that the Ohio Bankers League and working with others was able to create to pay for the training and or certification examination necessary for teachers who are not business, family consumer science, or social studies teachers to go and get trained. So now they can also teach personal finance. And this expanded the group of teachers to be able to teach it to any existing high school teacher, as long as they receive the validation. What does Ohio need? Unfortunately, right now, the validation is being written and compromised, and people are working hard to basically waive anybody. So there's language out there that just simply says, hey, if a superintendent thinks that this teacher knows what they're doing, they can teach it. And they could be just an art teacher, and the superintendent doesn't want to deal with it. The art teacher doesn't want to go to the training. They come to this agreement, and then that's what they do. Math wants to be excluded, even though they have never taught personal finance in a way where it would have counted toward the previous embedment requirement, or they never had any personal finance classes that were a part of their praxis. But again, that's just something they're trying to work in the validation. So what can Ohio do? Ohio can kind of push back and say, look, we have to do what's in the best interest of kids. And it's not in the best interest of kids to have somebody who doesn't know anything about personal finance, has never demonstrated anything about personal finance, being their only source for some kids for a financial education. I would argue that that's actually counterproductive. I would argue that for kids who are put into that position, if it was my kid and I was not financially literate myself, I would not want my child in that class, because I am exposing my child to people who could potentially be telling them to do the wrong thing. And my child's going to trust their teacher because that's what they've been taught. And that has a pernicious impact that is certainly counterproductive towards what the end goal of this bill was. So stand strong. What can Ohio do? Stand strong, ensure that the validation requirement is going to be written in a way as it was intended, and that was to do what's in the best interest of kids, and to provide the funding mechanisms to ensure that teachers are going to be trained without any cost out of their own pocket. And during the school day, there's money, a stipend for them to be able to have a substitute teacher as well.
Yeah, I would say lessons learned from our vantage point was we wrote a lot, we left a lot up to be written and promulgated in rules from the Department of Education. So we purposefully wrote that in the legislation to leave a lot of the validation things, the curriculum, up to the Department of Education. And sort of lessons learned from our scenario was we needed to be more involved after the legislation passed to influence the promulgation of those rules as well. And so I would encourage those of you that the finish line, while it may feel like a finish line when the governor signs the legislation, you have to really keep monitoring and working, keep the stakeholders together to make sure by enactment it is what you intended when you wrote the legislation.
That's a great point. That legislation, it doesn't end once that legislation is signed. We had one final planned question for the panel, and it actually coincides really well with a question that was submitted by one of our attendees. So we have a group of 8th grade students who are joining us today who would like to see change in Illinois' curriculum standards. So they said that they have written their senator and they want to ask if there's anything else that you would recommend that they do.
I would say they keep using your voice, keep working with other groups that align with you. Go out there and find other folks who support this. As an example, I'm a constituent of only one senator and one representative. So you need representation around the state of people who support the same things you support in order to influence senators across the partisan divide, as well as in different areas of the state than you are coming from. Brian, I know you've energized and brought 8th graders to testify before the state house. If you want to maybe expand on that.
Yeah, so they were high schoolers. So even tracing back to the pre-bill conversations that Evan shared earlier. So before the bill's introduced, you typically have meetings with interested parties where you're trying to shake out as much as possible, so it's not dead on arrival. I brought my students into a couple of those meetings because at the end of the day, an education is for them, and they deserve, I believe, a seat at the table. So for those 8th grade students, write your representative and tell them you want a seat at the table. You don't want to just write a letter. You want to seat at the table. And if you're in the 8th grade, you might be a little too young for IP meetings. But my students now, they were seniors at the time, but you can certainly testify. And your voice, I would argue your voice matters as much, if not more, than everybody else's, because we are here for you, and that you should offer to whoever that lawmaker is, your willingness to go to an education committee meeting if a bill is introduced, testify, support it, and share why you believe a financial education is something that you deserve.
Thank you. And thank you to the students for joining this webinar. I know you all were on yesterday, and we're happy to support. NEFI's here to help support those efforts, and I'm sure Brian and Evan would be willing to help with anything as you all move forward with your advocacy. That's awesome. All right, a couple of questions about the funding mechanism itself. So what would happen if those front-loaded funds were not paid back? And a second question is, where the majority of contributions to the fund, where did that come from?
Sure. So we had to meet with our state treasurer, and we had to build some goodwill between us and him to make sure he understood this is going to be fully within your authority. And if it is not paid back, it's coming out of the state treasurer's budget. And so that's what would have happened had there been no donations to the fund. However, that's not how we pitched it to the state treasurer. The way we pitched it to the state treasurer is he's a politician who has to run for reelection. And this is something that he can really get his arms around to go out to the public and say, I'm working incredibly hard to make sure financial literacy, your kids are financially literate. No offense to any state treasurers out there, but what you do what a state treasurer does on a day-to-day basis isn't necessarily going to be top of mind for voters. But this really was. I mean, this was something that the state treasurer was able to go out there and talk to rooms full of people all throughout Ohio why he was getting involved. And so we needed him to have some skin in the game, but he also found it mutually beneficial for him to be able to say, this is something that I really want to get accomplished in my time as a state treasurer. The majority of the funds have come from private industry, typically from banks, larger institutions here in Ohio, who want to be supportive of the state's efforts, and feel a responsibility to educate the students here in Ohio.
Great, thank you. We have another question asking about, can you expand on the curriculum which would be used or provided to teachers? What qualifies the teachers to teach the various topics, which has been covered a little bit. And then who are the experts that are providing the templates for this program?
Yeah, so in Ohio, it's a locally controlled state, and I don't think I've ever met with somebody who said that their state was not locally controlled. So we simply have state standards that were developed in 2011. Those standards were developed in private-public partnership efforts, where there were classroom teachers. I was one of them, and then representatives from the Bankers League, Credit Union, Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, that came together under the guidance of the Ohio Department of Education to work through what those standards would be. And then I believe it's 3 years, it's either 3 or 5 years, there's a cycle where those standards are revised. So the standards themselves they're very similar to what you would see from the Jumpstart Council of Economic Education national standards. And the State Department has nothing to do with determining the curriculum that's used, right? So what is taught is determined by the state standards. So when the bill was passed, we explicitly stated that the class itself, the semester-long class, needed to be taught and then we listed the state standards, because there were actually 3 sets of financial literacy standards. So to ensure that there was no confusion, it was the semester-long class standards. And so now this bill's passed where the standards are what must be taught, and then local schools determine how to teach it. So they determine curriculum.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, since we're going to be wrapping up around 11:40 or 11:45, or depending on where you're at, 1:45, 12:45. I'm in Mountain Time, so that's where we're at. But I wanted to ask, why did you find that the teachers union wasn't interested in putting vocal support behind the measure? Isn't expanding the budget for and staffing numbers of statewide teachers numbers a big plus for the union? Hiring can be challenging, but it seems like it would ultimately be positive.
Okay, this is important. It did not increase staffing numbers. It did not increase the need for additional teachers. That's very important. Yeah, it's a tricky issue for the teachers union, because you can make a very loose and dislocated argument as a music teacher, an art teacher, that kids might somehow not take one of their classes because of this new requirement. So if let's say we were to write it where instead of 20 hours to graduate, you need 20.5 credit hours to graduate, and the government is going to fund all these new teachers through tax dollars, that makes it easy for the teachers union. They could just support it. But that's dead on arrival. So they were in a very tough position, but they also recognize that as a whole, this certainly helps teachers.
And one thing I'll add on that is, you know, interest groups, trade associations, unions, they are asked to either be a proponent of the legislation, an opponent of the legislation, or there is a third option. You're an interested party or you're neutral on it. And so Brian did a lot of great work in getting the Ohio Education Association and some of the other teachers unions here in the state of Ohio to get to the neutral position, which is fine. I mean, it means they're not going to actively push the bill forward, certainly not publicly, but making sure that they weren't opposing it, making sure they weren't putting roadblocks in, was just as important as if they were to sign on to the bill altogether. So, in fact, getting the unions to the neutral position, I think, was really sort of the last thing we needed before getting the bill introduced.
Yeah, this is, and I'm not suggesting this was the case in Ohio, but you also have to think politically. If you are in a very red district, do you want to be in political alignment with a teachers union, right? So you have to be aware of just the challenges that lawmakers face when they're trying to decide how to work through this, and it's not just as simple as saying kids should learn personal finance.
Wonderful. Thank you all for sharing this. I want to thank both Evan and Brian for participating today. It was very insightful conversation. It was great learning more about the efforts in Ohio. Is there anything you all would like to share that hasn't been asked? We can close out with that, and then I'll share a reminder about our continuing webinar series.
The only thing I would say, I think a lot of education public policy, especially at the state level, normally includes the same individuals, the same interest groups, the same people. Broaden your coalition, invite other people into it, get them involved. It was incredibly important here in the state of Ohio. Every state capital is different. So I'm not saying you have to completely copy and paste exactly what we did here. You will have to do some of that political calculation in your state, but get other people who are not normally involved in education public policy to be involved in financial literacy. It absolutely affects every business, every family in your state, and there are going to be other interest groups that have an interest in this that you may not have considered before.
And the only thing I would add on to that excellent advice is to choose the right sponsor. You have to choose. We were very blessed. I've been in 7 states that have passed, and Ohio was the first, and that was while I was a teacher for most of that work. And I would put Senator Wilson up against anybody. His passion for this is the respect he has from his colleagues, and frankly, his willingness to use some political capital. because this is not easy. He had to use political capital to pass this. So you have to find a lawmaker that has the power to pass it and has the willingness to use some political capital to pass it.
Great. Well, thank you all for those final words. There are a couple questions in the Q&A box we were not able to get to, so I do want to say we will flag those and either follow up with Evan and Brian or send a note. But I want to close out with. We have our final part 3 of this policy webinar series tomorrow. So if you're interested in the evaluation piece, we will be focusing on that topic tomorrow with a researcher who's looking at Nevada currently to evaluate their financial education requirements, and some folks from the Utah Treasurer talking about the evaluation that they did in 2018 on the financial education requirements. So we'll be finishing up our webinar series tomorrow. Of course, recordings will be sent to everyone who registered, and we'll have additional webinars on various topics leading up to the 2024 Financial Education Innovation and Impact Summit. And then I just want to close out with, if you want to find more information about NEFI's work, please visit nefi.org. And thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.